Thanks, Stu. Honored to be here, and very good luck having John Joe go first, because he had a really good talk and introduced a lot of the ideas I'm going to talk about. He and I are pretty congruent in our views, but not fully. I'd say maybe 90% or so. So let me go through how we might differ a little bit. So as my title here suggests, we're going to compare the prevailing spike code view with the EM field approach, which John Joe's already done a nice job of talking about here. But let me start by going back a little bit, 9 years. What can Dave's hair tell us about consciousness? So I've been going to these meetings now for, I think, 12, 13 years, quite a while. 2014 was in Tucson, of course, and there's a tradition in Tucson of the zombie blues. And Dave created this tradition, and he volunteered a great rhyme this year. I went to the barber, got into the chair, said I'm sick and tired of all this damn hair. He cut off my hair, he cut off my qualia too. That's how I got the short haircut zombie blues. And the point here, of course, is that hair is akin to the EM field approach, and that was Dave's point too, because these are not new theories, they've been around for a long time. And I'll discuss the details more here to come. I want to first give a shout out to my colleague and mentor and friend, Jonathan Schooler, here somewhere. This is back in 2015 in Helsinki on the left. Here's Schooler and I at Burning Man. Went a few times together. And then here's us here, of course, in Taormina. I'm going to give a quick summary, give you some navigation. Dave's hair, done. Metaphors of the mind, I'll talk about in a minute. I want to give a shout out to this amazing book I just finished, actually, as an audio book, Driving Through the Desert in Arizona, by Megan O'Giblin, called God, Human, Animal, Machine. And it's a really interesting look at kind of spirituality, technology, AI, meaning, highly recommended. Then I'll talk about spike codes a bit, then about M fields and ephaptic field effects, offer a final metaphor of the mind, and then if I have time, I'll talk about is AI conscious, does it matter, and then how to train AI to be spiritual. So metaphors of the mind, not a new idea in itself, but it's important, I think, to highlight that almost all ideas, well, really, you could frame all ideas as metaphors. And certainly in trying to understand our own minds, we're always grasping for metaphors. Going back to Leibniz, or probably a lot earlier, where he talked about a water mill as an example of how a machine couldn't possibly be conscious, because if you look inside it, or any machine, no matter how small you go, you're never going to see perception or consciousness. And I'll talk about why that metaphor is maybe useful as a learning tool, but not entirely accurate when it comes to EM fields. Was the mind like a clock? That was talked about for some time as clocks became a thing. And then, of course, in the age of computers, the mind became a computer. And Stu talked about the quantum orchestra, looking at quantum effects in the brain and in biology. Mei-Wan Ho, an amazing scholar who died a few years ago, wrote a series of books, including The Rainbow and the Worm, which I highly recommend. She talked about quantum jazz as a good metaphor for the mind. Neural networks, and then the spike code, of course, is an extension of the neural network idea. And then last, I'll talk about fields. So I'm going to compare primarily the spike code approach and the EM field approach. So what is a spike code? This is, again, the prevailing view in today's neuroscience, I think it's fair to say. And this, in very short summary, is the view that neuronal and, in particular, synaptic activities are the key dynamics supporting consciousness. And so if you ask, most neuroscientists today, they'd probably say, yeah, that sounds right. And we're going to go through and see why that's not a full picture. And I guess that I'll add this too, is that it's been made explicit in various works over the years that this view is that synaptic activities are both necessary and sufficient for consciousness. And I'm going to offer evidence as to why that's not the case. And this approach goes back to 1943 at least. McCulloch and Pitts developed the neural network idea with their idealized neuron and neural networks. And the key feature of their approach is that neurons were conceived as being all or none operations. And we're going to see how that's probably not the case for how neurons actually work. And he made it explicit in a later work. Warren McCulloch said, every circuit built by God or man must exemplify the neural network in some form. And we'll see in a little bit how it's interesting how the metaphors have gone back and forth from neuroscience to computer science back to neuroscience, et cetera, with this idea of artificial neural networks and biological neural networks, and each being kind of a mirror of the other. So are spikes the whole story? What if they're not necessary or sufficient? I'm going to offer the challenging view, one of the challenging views here, on EM field approaches that relies primarily on ephaptic field effects. And ephaptic field effects are defined as non-neurotransmitter effects. So it means literally without touching. And the first paper in this kind of tradition, as far as I know, came out in 1942, a year before McCulloch and Pitts, by Arvanitaki. Can spikes explain brain dynamics? You've got a lot of evidence going back for many years, including Freeman and Vitiello, and Giuseppe is here with us. Unfortunately, Walter died a few years ago. But this is a paper I like to cite on this, this question. The dominant mechanism of synaptic transmission should impose distance-dependent delays on the EEG oscillations owing to finite propagation velocities and sequential synaptic delays. It does not. So a very clear statement. And one could argue, if you're being kind of a purist, a purist falsificationist, that this is a falsification of the spike code approach. Now, of course, falsification in reality is much more messy than that. And Stu mentioned this paper. I'm not going to read the whole quote. I'm just going to kind of show it, and you can take a picture if you want. But there's also evidence from Yaron Jakubowicz et al., 2008, looking at neurons and finding how they are, in fact, very well balanced in a way that is not expected given the spike code approach. So they say something in the structure or the distribution of noise sources ensures a uniform voltage noise, and they call this paradoxical because it's not expected. And there's a lot more in this vein, of course. More philosophically and big picture, can the spike code explain our mind? And there's a great book, I showed it earlier, by Mark Humphreys a few years ago, called The Spike, and he goes through in great detail how optical signals go through the optical nerve, through the retina, optical nerve, to motor neurons. And he acknowledges, I think being appropriately humble, at the end of the book, he says, the most obvious chasm in our understanding is in all the things we did not meet on our journey from your eye to your hand, all the things of the mind I've not been able to tell you about because we know so little of what spikes do to make them. So he's not saying it can explain it. He's saying we don't know yet, given the spike code approach. And so obviously, we don't know everything. In fact, we know very little, even in the spike code approach. So he's being humble, but my point here is that this current approach does not do very much to explain the mind itself, and that's acknowledged, I think. And then more generally, we can look at these models being built of awareness and consciousness and the mind, and I think it's an important point, and it's not me making this for the first time, it's made by many others too, that you can have as detailed a model of any phenomenon you want, but if it's just a simulation, it will have no impact in the real world. If you model a hurricane in every detail, it will destroy no buildings. If you model the mind in every detail, it will not be conscious unless you have the appropriate substrate, if you agree that the substrate is X, as Dave talked about. So how do neurons communicate? There is the prevailing view, already covered in great detail, that the spike code is the primary means. Everyone would acknowledge it's not the only means of communication. Gap junctions are widely acknowledged. The question is how much they contribute to the overall system, diffusion more generally. Ephaptic field effects, EM field effects, are acknowledged but still quite controversial. I'm going to go through the more recent research to show they shouldn't be controversial. There's also good evidence that mechanical action waves play a role. And then more controversially, biophotons and then quantum effects. I'm not going to talk about the last two, but I want to acknowledge that they are out there as a strong possibility. So the key thing already mentioned is that ephaptic field effects are non-synaptic. I'm going to discuss briefly Chang et al. 2019. This is one that really kind of woke me up personally, and I think a lot of people in the field, because it showed, really pretty definitively that yes, these effects are real. They took a mouse hippocampus, and they took a slice out, and then they cut that slice longitudinally, and then they put that slice back together and looked for influence, correlations, and firing across that gap. There were no synapses, there were no dendrites grown back in the gap, and they found almost no difference in correlations in firings. This was unexpected, and the journal they submitted to said, double check that. They did it. They said, triple check that, please. And they did it. Then they finally published it. And so obviously one can debate this, and it hasn't been replicated in a great, I don't know of any particular study so far that's replicated it exactly. But in this case, they've had a lot of, let's say, scrutiny of their results, and other papers have found similar findings, such as Ruffini et al. 2020. And this paper kind of comes out a bit more stronger in their conclusions, and they really make the case for, look, this is, in fact, a major new communication system in the brain, in neurons more generally. And they say, well, I guess I should soften that a little bit. They say a potential new cellular communication system, i.e. ephaptic transmission. And a key point of this mechanism is not just like, oh, it's another way we communicate. It's a much faster means of communication, like much, much faster, like orders of magnitude faster. Because as John Joe mentioned, the information is going into the global field, in and around the brain. And if that field was in a vacuum, it would travel at the speed of light. Of course, we're not in a vacuum, we're in the brain. And so they actually measured this in this paper. So it's a lot slower than 300,000 kilometers per second, but it's still very, very fast. It's 47 and 57 kilometers per second, respectively, in gray matter and white matter. So you can imagine very quickly how fast it is in a little space like the brain. So you have a lot more information transfer potential with that kind of speed. So Bruce McIver at Stanford said in a recent paper that M-field theories offer a simple solution to the binding problem of our unified conscious experience. So this goes exactly what John Joe was talking about. This appears to be, and it's still speculation, this appears to be a very ready mechanism for creating a global unified experience because it is so pervasive and it is so incredibly fast. And that paper is actually part of a research topic that I'm lead editor for. Our friend is in human neuroscience, along with Jonathan, along with John Joe, some other folks also. And we've got now a dozen papers either published or in the queue, a couple more coming out soon. So this is kind of the, I'd say, still fairly early days for this approach, but it's building some steam. So recent M-field theories of the mind. Susan Pock, I think, gets credit for being the first kind of detailed theory back in around 2000, I believe. She's actually since stopped working in this area, and quite adamantly so. I've actually reached out to her, and she's like, not doing that anymore. And she said it's because of the military, interestingly. She doesn't want to be part of that hacking of the mind, essentially. John Joe, of course, and I read his book back in 2008, Quantum Evolution, and I give John Joe a lot of credit for that because it definitely got me thinking a lot and got me on the path I'm on now. So thank you, John Joe, for that. Mohsen Jones, another collaborator of mine, I'll talk about in a minute. Anirban is talking, I think, two speakers after me here today. Done some great work in this area. Joachim Kepler, who I think left but was here. Colin Hale is a colleague in Australia. Eric Bond, Jesse Winters, Warden Guevara, and our own approach, which we call the general resonance theory of consciousness, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the M-field hypothesis in a nutshell. So what if these spatiotemporal nested M-fields generated by but not identical with the neuroanatomy of the brain are in fact the primary seat of the mind? And what if, as John Joe said quite clearly in his talk, what if the mind simply is a nested set of interacting M-fields? And in this view, neurons and synaptic transmission are necessary but not sufficient for consciousness. And another great book I recommend here, Electric Brain by Doug Fields. And it's a survey, it's not an argument, but he does make the case in a fairly soft and I think cautious way that not only are M fields causally potent, but they probably are the seat of consciousness. And just a quick primer here, there's various ways to measure these M fields. EEG on the surface of the scalp, ECOG on the surface of the cortex, and LFP spikes go into the brain with electrodes. And so you get different information back by measuring at different depths. And it's important to keep that in mind in the data you're looking at. I was talking to Jim Poggles, who was here until yesterday, and learned from him, he's been doing EEG for decades, that you can't measure theta with EEG. You have to go to ECOG or LFP. And theta, when you use ECOG in mammal brain, is in fact the most predominant frequency band. But when you use EEG, you wouldn't know that. A quick illustration of the scales we're talking about here. The micro scale, and this would be, the local LFP and, synaptic transmission itself. Synaptic firing, what's called a micro scale. Mesoscale, regional, looking at kind of circuits and nuclei in the brain. And then the macro scale will be the whole brain. And in our view, there is a large hierarchy of nested fields throughout this. This is just, one illustration of, part of that hierarchy, but of course it's far, far more. And you can go down, I'll mention this real quick, to microtubular level at terahertz scale, and you can certainly create an argument that that may be the origin of the physical scale. And then it may go up, and it may go much higher, of course, than human consciousness. It could go, in fact, as John Joe speculated about, it could go, interplanetary, galactic, universal. Probably very, very slow transmission, though, at that point. So the mind appears to be a nested hierarchy of various M fields and other brain and body rhythms. And the function in the brain itself of, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma appears to be kind of a syntax. And there's a lot of evidence now and research done by Buzaki, Berger, and Benjamin, many people now looking at how these systems work, and it appears that theta is kind of the highway of these semantic packets and computational units in the brain. So looking now at our theory, GRT, which is an M-field theory of mind, we began writing about this using this terminology maybe 5 years ago. And I wrote a piece for Scientific American called "The Hippies Were Right. It's All About Vibrations, Man." And this caught on, it resonated, and I think it's the most viral piece I've written, and it got like almost 1 million views. And who knows why, but good timing, good title, who knows. But we followed up a year later with a big paper in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience called "The Easy Part of the Hard Problem: A Resonance Theory of Consciousness." And I'm not going to talk about this in great detail. I'm just going to mention a couple points. GRT is explicitly a panpsychist theory, so that's actually where we differ a bit from John Joe. I think John Joe's just a bit reticent to kind of come out of the closet maybe, but ours is explicitly a panpsychist theory. We have no problem with that. Now it's like, who cares if you're panpsychist? It makes sense to me. It's not controversial anymore. And of course, we're not saying an atom has any complex awareness. It's extremely rudimentary. It's almost maximally rudimentary, but you've got to start somewhere. And it complexifies as matter complexifies. That's really the only point. And that complexification process is achieved through shared resonance. So as different physical structures achieve a shared resonance, because all things resonate at some frequency, then they join up. And when they are sufficiently proximate and have a shared resonance, they then actually achieve a unified mind. And that's the combination problem solved in our view. So there is a vast nested hierarchy of resonating fields in complex biological systems in particular, which is why you have such interesting minds in humans and other mammals and other animals, and you don't have in a comparable mass rock, for example. There's not much interesting connectivity going on in a rock, but there is in complex evolved bodies. I want to highlight Wolfgang Kleinmesch's work. He's developed a theory with a rather clunky name, but it's a very powerful theory. He calls it the binary hierarchy brain-body oscillation theory. And he's emeritus now. He's still doing some work, but not much. But he highlights in a really interesting 2018 paper how it's not just these nested rhythms of EEG in the brain, but it goes down a lot further. And again, probably up a lot further too. You look at high gamma 160, very high gamma 160, high gamma 80, gamma 40, beta, etc. Get down to heart rate at 1.25 hertz, breathing muscle contractions 0.625, breathing 0.15, down to bold, which is MRI, blood flow signals. And you actually have a 1-to-2 relationship, a binary hierarchy, all the way down between those 12 different domains. This is not widely known. And it kind of makes sense intuitively if you think about it that this appears to be how our systems work, when they're being efficient. When they're not being efficient, when you're sick or out of sorts, out of sync, you're literally out of sync. And when you're feeling good, when you're optimizing your function, you're in sync. And so looking at the body more generally, not just the brain, we do have good data now showing synchrony, resonance between different organs. There's a 20-second 0.05 hertz rhythm in the gut that partially entrains the brain's alpha rhythms. The iocicala rhythms have interesting relations with the brain also, cardiac neuron. We wrote a paper a few years ago called The Slowest Shared Resonance, Asa Young, myself, and Marissa, and we go through the data up to that point. And we are now, finally, it's been a slow process, testing our conjectures, and Asa is our star graduate student kind of leading the way. Marissa Erickson and Stephen Baumgart are helping him. And this summer, we're actually going to start our first, serious data collection efforts, and we're going to be testing kind of a combination of conjecture 1 and conjecture 3 in GRT, which we call the shared resonance conjecture, and then the nested consciousness conjecture. So stay tuned. Maybe next year I'll be invited back and give a talk on that. I'm going to skip this slide. So, is it fields or firings or both? And you probably know the answer already. I'm suggesting it's both. I want to also clarify that firings are a species, are a subset of fields. This is not controversial. It's all EM fields. I think John Joe said this himself. The physics of life is the physics of EM fields. It's all EM fields. The question is, at what scale are we looking at? If we're looking just at synaptic firing, we're looking at one scale and leaving out a lot of what is, in our view, causally potent. So I want to bring up a final metaphor. And this works partly, I think. Is the brain like a tightly interwoven forest canopy? And in this case, the trunks and the branches are the neuroanatomy, the neurons, the synaptic firing, looking at that in detail, so at least what we call the connectome. Above and beyond that, the more temporally fine-grained structure of the brain would be the M fields, and this would be like the twigs and the leaves on the trees. And we call this the resinum, meaning mapping that structure. And the point here is that you could, in fact, have structure and causal potency in the connectome that wouldn't be picked up. It wouldn't be able to pick up influences that the resinum, the more temporally fine-grained structure, could pick up. So this is not a meaningless distinction. It's actually quite, causally and ontologically meaningful. I'm going to try this video. Let's see if this works. Yeah, it looks like it doesn't work. But this is a video of a wind going over a canopy. And I wanted to kind of show a 3D version of the metaphor. In that, as that EM field blows through the brain, so to speak, it's going to influence the field itself at a much more spatially temporally fine-grained manner than it would influence the neuroanatomy. So there is, again, a vast amount of complexity possible in this approach that isn't available to you under the traditional spike code approach. And I want to emphasize, too, though, metaphors always fail, and the mind is ultimately just like the mind. It's pretty unique. How much time do I have, Stu? 7 minutes. Is that Q&A also? No. Okay, so I can do... Okay, so I'll do some thoughts on AI and consciousness. So I want to look at the same question that Dave talked about in his keynote. Are LLMs conscious? Large language models, kind of the most advanced AIs we have today. And we wrote a paper last year, myself, Marissa, and Jonathan, called Where is My Consciousness-ometer? And we sketch out a framework for looking at this kind of question, a general framework that can be used to look at any system at all, including LLMs. And we look at what we call the measurable correlates of consciousness. And we start with behavioral, which in this case would be the verbal outputs of the LLMs. And if you're looking more generally at like the art they produce, I'll talk about that in a second. You also look at the neural correlates of consciousness, which are not present in any similar way in LLMs, of course. It's a computer architecture. And you would look at, in our framework, the creative correlates, which mean the outputs more generally, which could include the verbal output, visual output, whatever things that LLMs can put out in the future or today. Also, we distinguish in this approach with the NCC that we can and should look at the EM field correlates of consciousness in addition to the the synaptic correlates for all the reasons I've just discussed here. So I have written about that in the LLM context, and I kind of conclude like Dave did that obviously we don't know. That's the bottom line. We can't know. I kind of liked intuitively his numbers in terms of less than 10% chance today they're at all conscious. But I generally agree with some folks who have made the case over the years that we probably aren't going to get anything like our consciousness on today's von Neumann architecture computers. And so many folks have talked about this, including Christoph Koch in his 2019 book, The Failing of Life Itself. And he talks about neuromorphic computers, and he shows in this great image here that you could have, in theory, a supercomputer or an LLM on a supercomputer that could be very intelligent. It is already today very intelligent, but have zero or very little consciousness. And then the brain organoid is the top left here, and that could, in theory, be quite conscious, but not very intelligent, showing that they don't actually necessarily correlate. My colleague Colin Hales, also an editor on the special research topic, has been working for years to develop what he calls neuromimetic chips. And these go a step further, and they actually are trying to emulate the EM field structure that brains create. And so his view is that if you could do this in a chip architecture, you add the appropriate software, perhaps something like the Blums talked about yesterday, which to me felt pretty accurate. If you have that kind of software on the appropriate hardware, you should get conscious entities, but who knows, we'll find out. I do want to talk a bit about AI safety. This is a growing field for obvious reasons, and I'm hoping that next TSC we have a panel on this because it's a really important topic in my view. I have been appropriately freaked out by AI in the last 6 months, like a lot of us have, and I tend to think in trajectories and where are we going, and the pace of change is very impressive but also very scary for that reason. Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, said just a couple of days ago that his concern with AI is in fact existential, and we define this as many people harmed or killed, and he's not the only one saying this kind of thing. It sounds pretty extreme rhetoric, but when you think about where things go with super intelligent godlike AI, it's not too hard to see really dire scenarios coming about unless we're very careful. So I signed on to this letter you probably heard about, the Future of Life Institute open letter calling for a pause and a moratorium on AI further than GPT 4.0. That's already out there. You can't close that box, but you can stop doing more complex ones until we figure out are we doing a wise thing or not. So I wrote a piece, just came out yesterday in Scientific American. Here's why AI may be extremely dangerous, whether it's conscious or not. And this is a debate, right? Well, can it break its programming if it's unconscious, or will it just have to follow its programming? And I make the case that it doesn't matter if it's conscious or not. It can be very dangerous in the same way a nuclear bomb is dangerous without being remotely conscious. It can do a lot of bad in the world without being conscious at all. So one last idea here, then I'll close. I'm working on a paper on AI safety, proposing what I call the heuristic spiritual imperatives. And it's recognizing that if AI is going to become godlike, as it seems like it's on a pretty good path to becoming, in its power and its intelligence, why not do what we can to help it become godlike in its wisdom? And so I'll leave you with this. I won't read them, but basically this is a set of heuristics inspired by David Shapiro's approach, which he calls the heuristic imperatives. And this is designed to create, to basically imbue the coming superintelligent AI with a spiritual imperative, which both makes it restrained in its actions in the world, but also designed to help us achieve more spiritual enlightenment or awareness, however you want to define that. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Good time, thank you. We have time for